Well, hey folks, how you doing? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks a lot for joining me here again today, and thanks a lot for being a supporter for all this time. And if you're new to my channel, welcome. Well, it's been about 1 week since we had our disclosure announcement from the Department of Defense. You'll remember last Saturday, as of the recording of this video, the Department of Defense released the footage of the F-18 training flights near the USS Nimitz aircraft task force group out in the Pacific Ocean, with the F-18s encountering these objects that they couldn't identify, they couldn't keep up with, had extraordinary flight characteristics, and so forth. And this story really has become amazingly a viral story, a story that's been picked up by all the major news outlets. It's been covered just about every day on the major media. We can't underestimate the importance of these events over the past couple of days, because for the first time we're hearing people on major news networks from the government, mainstream journalists, and former Navy fighter pilots all come forward to tell us in no uncertain terms that these objects that are in the video, and we're told there are more videos like this that are going to be released by the Department of Defense, in no uncertain terms that these objects are not from any country that they know about on Earth. And we're talking about the Department of Defense here, so you would think that they would know what other types of weapon systems would exist in other countries, what the United States has. You have to remember, even going back to the 1950s, early days of Project Blue Book, so-called Project Sign, being conducted at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. There was extensive dialogue within the Air Force and between the different branches of the military, whether this was some sort of secret government program. After all, the technicians at Wright-Patterson were trying to figure out what these UFOs were. We know this because the documents have been declassified, and Project Sign, as it was called back then, concluded that these had to be from an off-planet, extraterrestrial. They said, if it's not coming from the United States, and we know what the Soviet Union has, because we're talking about the late 1940s and then early 1950s, at that time the Soviet Union were interested in reverse engineering our B-17 aircraft. Okay, so if they were interested in reverse engineering aircraft such as the B-17, they wouldn't have had their own UFOs. The Project Sign created a document called the Estimate. The estimate concluded that this was extraterrestrial, these objects that the military were encountering ever since Roswell in 1947 and perhaps before. And we know that the estimate was on the orders of General Vandenberg, was burned. It was literally destroyed. There are no copies left of this Air Force, internal Air Force document, because one of the higher-ups in the Air Force decided that the United States was not ready to hear that this was extraterrestrial. So look how far we've come just in 15 years. Now, excuse me, in 50 years. I wanted just to show you that this is not a new debate. It's in history and in science. It's been going on for a long time. The debate whether objects originate from off-planet goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And let's just take a look at some examples of that. Now, this debate that we're having now, right now, as I'm recording this video, in the United States and probably around the world, do these objects originate from off-planet, or, as some are arguing, Seth Shostak of the SETI program, that looks for signs of extraterrestrial life through radio telescopes, radio signals from far away in space. The folks like Seth Shostak are arguing these have to be terrestrial objects. But this type of argument came up many years ago. About 200 years ago, a fellow by the name of Ernst Florence Friedrich Chladni was an acoustic physicist. He originated the idea of cymatics, that if you took vibrations on, you created vibrations on metal plates, you would create these coherent patterns. He would take a bow and use the bow on a metal plate that had sand on top, and if you did that, you would create what he called nodal modes. They showed that sound and structure were related in some way. In other words, sounds could create shapes, shapes could create sounds, and this became the basis of wave dynamics. It became the basis of the Schrödinger wave equation in quantum mechanics. Chladni really is the originator of acoustics and the quantum wave function. More importantly, though, for our purposes here at the moment, he was the first to argue that meteorites had an extraterrestrial origin. Back then, in Chladni's day, in the 18th century, 19th century, early 19th century, no one could believe that meteorites originated from outside the Earth. And they argued that meteorites were either from lightning strikes on the Earth, hurling stones up in the air, or they were coming out of volcanoes. They were called volcano stones. I learned about this, by the way, from sociologist Ron Westrom from Michigan State University. And Chladni was the first to basically argue that these stones were actually from outer space. Now, if you're wondering why people couldn't believe that this could be true, at the time, beliefs about what happened in and around the Earth were still guided by Aristotle's ideas. And Aristotle argued that nothing happened beyond the distance of the moon, the so-called superlunary area. It was considered to be static. It was known that there were other planets out there. They were thought to be fixed on crystalline spheres, and nothing was thought to happen out beyond the area of the moon. In our area, called the sublunary area, there was considered to be activity and motion, you know, what we see in the atmosphere. But no one could conceive that stones could fall out of the sky. And the French Academy of Sciences went around confiscating all the meteorites out of French museums because they decided that they were simply ordinary earth stones. And other countries like England and Germany followed with their science museums also. So there was a time when meteorites were confiscated as nothing more than ordinary earth material. And Chladni came along and argued, no, that these could be extraterrestrial. And these are the first sorts of extraterrestrial arguments in recent modern history. Of course, one day in the town of L'Aigle, France, hundreds or thousands of meteorites fell overnight, and it proved once and for all that this was a real phenomenon. But this was a real debate around 200 years ago, whether meteorites were of extraterrestrial origin or not. And then before Chladni, we had our scientist, Galileo Galilei, who made the same sorts of arguments. He argued that the Earth was no longer the center of the universe. He created telescopes. He wasn't the first to create telescopes, but he created telescopes. He looked through them. He worked with microscopes before that, but he turned his microscopes to the sky and they became telescopes. And Galileo argued to us that, in fact, what he was seeing were changes in the light of the moon, which suggested that the sun might be the center of our solar system and not the Earth. And then he found moons going around Jupiter and so forth. He was basically advancing the arguments of Copernicus and saying that the Earth was no longer the center of the universe, that the sun was the center of our solar system. Now, there were other alternative arguments that perhaps the solar system was the center of the universe, but Galileo was one of the first to argue that we were not, in fact, the center of the universe. And we know what happened to Galileo. He was put on trial by the Vatican, and he was found guilty of adhering to Copernican beliefs, or at least not denying Copernican beliefs, a slightly lesser charge, and he was put under house arrest for the rest of his life. So people have paid a heavy price to argue another point of view. If we went back even farther, a contemporary of Galileo was Giordano Bruno, who went around Europe. He was a philosopher and a poet and what was called back then a natural philosopher, which now we think of as science. And he argued that perhaps the universe was infinite and there would be other people and animals on other planets if we could only observe them. This was before the telescope even existed. Now, this view was incredibly unpopular, and he was also attacked by the church. And because of the impact of these cosmological ideas on the Catholic Church, he was put to death. He was burnt at the stake for the things that he had said. It wasn't directly for the idea that the universe was infinite, but he was an adherent to these ideas, and they were not popular at the time, and his life was cut short for saying what he believed to be true at the time. So the extraterrestrial argument is not entirely new, and it really starts with Bruno. He really suggested that the universe is infinite and very much different than the Aristotelian view, which had guided science ever since antiquity. And so recently, this week, we had these 5 folks go on all the mainstream media and tell us that they have evidence that there are objects that we are observing here, a little bit like Chladni, saying that they are not from Earth. Now, they're not definitively saying that these are extraterrestrial objects. Luis Elizondo, who you can see here in the upper right, has said that these objects are leaving behind residues with isotopic ratios that are not found on Earth. So what does that suggest to you? Also, Ralph Blumenthal, right below him, has talked about this facility in Las Vegas where these materials are kept. And we're told that there's also research being done on how people are affected by these isotopically anomalous materials. Some suggestions that they have an effect on our consciousness in some way that we haven't fully found out about yet. But these 5 individuals, to me, have really issued quite a challenge to modern science. Because if we go back in history, science had to convince people of the time in the Middle Ages we should pay attention to evidence and not just to arguments and beliefs. Keep in mind, going back hundreds of years, science used to be called natural philosophy. It was based more on rhetoric and argumentation than on evidence. And folks like Copernicus and Galileo and many others came forward and said, no, we should look at the evidence. That's what tells us how the universe works. And it was quite a challenge back then for scientists to make any headway for their arguments to be believed, because people were so steeped in beliefs that they had at the time. But the fact is, we're no different. These individuals have come forward in the past week and told us we need to look at the evidence. They haven't suggested that it has to be extraterrestrial. They're just saying it's unexplained and it doesn't come from anywhere on Earth. Okay? So I think they presented a very strong challenge to science. After all, scientists have been telling us that there is no evidence for these phenomena, that it's mainly a hoax, or it's a misidentification, or something along these lines. Okay? And here we have 5 very credible people telling us, including the pilot himself, David Fravor at the bottom, who's telling us that he actually was the one, Commander Fravor was in the plane, one of the F-18s, that chased these objects. And he's telling us that this is unlike anything he's ever seen before. Moreover, what Fravor told us, amazingly enough, is that he first, before he saw this object that he chased in the F-18, he saw an object below the water that you could see the waves washing up over it. And he couldn't tell what it was. And he saw the object above it that we see in the video. And then he saw the object that we see in the video releasing smaller objects. So this is all very strange. Now, I have a lot of friends who don't believe this. They feel this is some sort of false flag operation. Of course, it's coming from the U.S. government. It has to be fake. But I don't think so. I think you don't get pilots like Fravor saying these things and making it up. Neither do you get New York Times correspondents like Blumenthal and Kane making these things up either. You have to see that there are many people involved with this, including Bob Bigelow himself, who's independently funded. I mean, he's a billionaire after all. Do you think billionaires let other people tell them what to do? So I believe this evidence. Of course, it's up to you. I'm not saying you have to believe it, but I think that this is disclosure, the real deal. and we will see. I am sure that more videos are going to be forthcoming. After all, this information had to be released by the Department of Defense, and I doubt they just wanted to release one video and let the whole thing slide. I'm imagining that there's more evidence coming forward. We're told we're going to be hearing more evidence about these isotopically rare materials, which I've been hearing about for a long time. And of course, we have to thank these 3 senators who started this in 2007. You have to keep in mind this started in 2007 with Harry Reid, Ted Stevens of Alaska, and Daniel Inouye. Senators Stevens and Inouye have passed over. They're no longer with us here. But these 3 senators funded this program back in 2007 because they realized how important this might be. And I think we can feel a little good about democracy here, that our democratic republic worked and that our representatives in Washington, D.C., actually, some of them did the right thing and decided to put a paltry amount of money, $22 million, into research into this program to find out what was going on, if these were a threat to military aircraft, if there were a possibility of collisions. I hear a lot of people critical of this. I mean, we're talking about aircraft safety here. This issue came up at the citizen hearing. It was none other than Merrill Cook, the former representative from Salt Lake City in Utah, who came forward and was one of the panelists at the citizen hearing, who told us that his concern was about aircraft safety, and he said that he was convinced by the evidence. So we're talking about aircraft safety here, and we all fly on planes, so this is something that we need to find out about. There have been collisions between civilian aircraft and UFOs. These objects have collided with at least civilian airliners. We know about that. I've seen very convincing evidence from pilots talking about this, and I'm sure it's happened with the military too, which is why they're probably want to find out what these objects are. In any case, this is a big challenge to science. Science has told us that this is not a real phenomena, and science at one time was a revolutionary sort of institution that challenged the church and older ideas from antiquity, Aristotle. But then it became very conservative and it wouldn't look at the evidence, and now we're seeing new evidence again that keeps reminds us to open our mind. So thanks again for watching. I appreciate your attention. Have a good one. We'll talk to you soon. Take care for now.